We're entering our last session, and it was kind of pulled together nicely, in our group where we talked about the intersectionality, which was, I guess, Jim's point of racial justice and environment. But what we wanted to do in our last section is turn over to Lisa Williams from the Ames group at GSAM, and Carolyn Tavares is still here as well. As you know, Carolyn is our lead investment consultant for both UCF and the pension boards. But in case you haven't seen Lisa's bio, we've met Lisa over the last period. She's a VP at the Manager Selection Group. Really came to Ames at GSAM from Imprint Capital, which, as you know, is the impact investment advisory firm that we hired and engaged back in 2016, and is part of GSAM now. Lisa worked at Halia, is it, Lisa?
Jalia Ventures.
Jalia Ventures, focused on business with deep community impact. Started her career at Citigroup as an associate in investment research. In terms of other background, Lisa serves on the board of directors of the nonprofit finance fund, BA from St. Peter's College, and was a Twigo fellow at Columbia Business School, where she has her MBA. So Lisa and maybe Carolyn is just going to take us through a bit of how the private markets are addressing climate change, and take us through a little bit of that landscape and maybe the opportunity set, because the public markets are one thing, where you can buy and sell public equities, but you have a chance in private markets to really impact climate change. We have a number of investments on the platform, but without further ado, Lisa, why don't you take us through how Imprint is looking and Ames is looking at the world of private equity climate impact.
Perfect. Thank you for the introduction. So for some context, the work that we do is really broad with regards to focusing both on environmental impact and social impact. And so the first slide that we have here, which really highlights how we think about this, I think is really important to note, because we can't think about environmental impact and social impact in silos, and everything is interconnected. And we're seeing a number of key trends that are really accelerating the growth of some of these investment themes. But it's important to keep in mind the different stakeholders who are impacted by how we think about allocating capital, and that some short-term decisions could have long-term detriment to these same stakeholders. And so whenever we're thinking about investment opportunities, we really, at the core, we're trying to find things that are appealing from a financial and investment standpoint. Our approach is really to look at critical themes from a climate transition and inclusive growth standpoint, and understand where we as impact investors can actually move the needle for our clients. So I just wanted to start with this one visual, which I think is important because of the large drivers that are really shaping how the market, investors, and stakeholders are thinking about these categories of investing. On the next slide, we really have the kind of sub-themes that we're focused on as we look at private market investing for both climate and social impact. So we call it climate transition and inclusive growth. And we really drive our, ground our strategy in some of the key drivers of climate change and the climate side. So you'll see here categories that you're familiar with. Our approach is really to understand each of these key themes and having a view on where we think trends are moving, and where, again, we can actually have a meaningful impact to either scaling a category that is not quite there, and in some instances taking risks that other investors might not yet be comfortable taking, because we recognize that it's important to really create a viable market. I think a good example of this is some of the investments that we did in renewable energy 10 years ago, which I think has parallels, which is another category that I'll talk about shortly. And the work that we've done working with largely nonprofits and a couple of institutions has really enabled and supported some of the innovations of kind of the early to mid 2000s that are now household names. And so I think we're really excited about really thinking through these specific themes, finding interesting fund managers and companies that we can allocate capital to. But again, going back to that initial slide, thinking about interconnectivity as it relates to both the social and environmental elements and how they can play off one another in a strategy. So the next slide is really highlighting kind of on the left side, our process. And as I mentioned, we kind of take a top-down look of the world. Different members of the team are focused on those environmental and social themes that I highlighted earlier. And we really try to do a comprehensive scan of the entire universe of investors. And it's not just impact investors. And I think that's important to highlight because we want to look at how the underlying dollars are being allocated, not just some fund that's telling us that they're doing impact or happens to be on a list of ESG strategies. We really want to understand how the folks who are making investment decisions are thinking about those underlying portfolios. So as we look at the full landscape, we continue to funnel it down based on some of the traditional, manager due diligence criteria, but we also think about impact and operational effectiveness along that entire process. And that really leads us to our top picks in each of these categories. So by way of working with PBUCC, you've probably seen one of our pipeline slides where we will mention one of these sub-themes and highlight opportunities that we think are of interest in those different categories. So to maybe spend some time specifically focused on climate transition, this is a category that we think is just very important. We see a number of interesting opportunities across the landscape. And when we think about these, I think 3 of them really get us quite excited. And that's kind of thinking about energy transition strategies, nature-based solutions, and then finally carbon technology. So on the energy transition side, this is really thinking about the market opportunity that's created by changing energy generation sources on the grid, mainly driven by more intermittent renewables. And so the main drivers of this transition has really been 3 things. Cost decline, so really looking at the cost curves of wind and solar. They've decreased dramatically over the past few years, and it's such that in many instances, they're often the lowest cost of new power generation in a number of regions around the world. And so we think that this presents a really interesting opportunity for new generation that's coming online to actually be renewable. The second is intermittency. So I think while there's a lot of promise from renewable energy, and we've seen, how this can scale effectively, I think the question of reliability for renewables is an important one. Solar only works when the sun is shining, windmills only turn when it's windy, and so you can't really turn these plants on and off like you could with conditional thermal fuel sources. And so there's a great opportunity to think about categories like energy storage to really improve the intermittency of renewable sources of energy. And so some of the innovations there are things that we're very intrigued by and spending some time thinking about manager strategies that are investing in those categories. The third driver of energy transition is really lower greenhouse gas emissions. I think that, regulation can be a double-edged sword. We've seen how it's really been able to accelerate change in these categories. And a number of states and regions have really set goals on carbon emissions reduction. So, achieving those goals has really incorporated a number of companies and institutions and organizations to really change their business practices to be successful in this domain. So I think overall in the energy transition area, we're really excited about the ability to build new renewable generation assets, but also to think about the interconnectivity and how we can have a more efficient and reliable system. So the second area, and one that is near and dear to my heart, and I've been spending a lot of time on recently, is nature-based solutions. And these are really real asset investments, primarily forestry and agriculture, where we think there's an opportunity to generate financial return, but also to achieve quantifiable environmental benefit through the sequestration of carbon. And so a lot of people know we plant a tree, it's good for the environment, but many don't really go into kind of the nuance that, trees, as they're growing in their biomass, their roots, their stems, they're taking carbon out of the air. And we've seen a lot of momentum in terms of institutional and corporate commitments to reduce their carbon footprint. Many of them have kind of started with looking at their operations and their supply chain and how can we, change what we're doing from a business standpoint, but that doesn't often go far enough and fast enough as they want. And so this nature-based category has really emerged as an area of interest, I think, for a couple of reasons. Traditionally, these same corporates would be likely to purchase offsets. And so there's been a lot of press recently around the quality of the offsets. What is the underlying project? What is the methodology that was used? Is there really additionality in terms of what's happening there? And we're excited about the nature-based offering because it really enables you to, I think, more accurately account for the amount of carbon because there's clear measurement around the trees in the ground and growth rates. You also have greater control over the social and environmental benefits by virtue of being an owner of the project itself rather than simply a counterparty. And then, I think that there's an opportunity to also scale these over time to really match the offset needs of an organization. And so we've been spending a lot of time in this, specifically a project that we are working on right now with Apple, where we have a $200 million portfolio that we're deploying on their behalf to really kind of try to scale the work that can be done in sustainable forestry. We're taking a very hands-on approach here because it requires looking at every single project and understanding local stakeholder considerations. How do we think about ecological integrity, biodiversity, as well as the carbon and the financial piece. And so we're working very closely with an environmental nonprofit to really pull all of those pieces together. And so, the nature-based opportunity, I think, is one that is very promising, but also can be quite complicated because there is potential for unintended consequences if you're not in close proximity to the actual asset. And then the third, I think, and final category that we're really excited about is carbon technology. And so this is really where we're looking at carbon removal technologies that are similar to what a tree would do naturally, that are really applied in an industrial manner to capture, utilize, or store carbon. We think this is a really important component of thinking about the decarbonization needs of the world. And if you look at kind of the IPCC special report on global warming, 88 of the 90 scenarios that they have looked at to really mitigate that 1.5 degree warming require some degree of carbon removal emissions technology deployed at scale. I think the challenge is that these are often very, very capital intensive, but we're seeing some really interesting opportunities in the space where science, more and more of the science has been proven. There's regulatory support for some of these business models so that the financial viability is much more enhanced than it was 5 to 10 years ago. And so we're paying very close attention to some of the opportunities to invest in carbon technology solutions for our clients. I know that I've covered quite a bit, so I also want to make sure that we have time for questions before kind of moving on any further.
I had a quick question here for you, Lisa. How would cap and trade and carbon tax incentivize investments in the opportunity? So the whole offset area, if it was required because there were taxes or fees on the other side.
Yeah, I think that it would have a tremendous impact. And so part of the reason why I have kind of regulation and carbon pricing as a challenge at the bottom, regulatory requirements to decarbonize in parts of the US and Europe was really what caused the accelerated focus on reduced emissions. And similar to how we saw regulatory support for solar, we think that the same can be done on the carbon technology side. So the science is proven for a lot of these innovations, but it is very expensive. And so with a proper price on carbon, some of these business models that would otherwise not be viable from a revenue standpoint, the economics start to pencil out much more when there's a viable carbon price in the market. So many are saying that the current unit carbon price is very low. And so as we continue to increase that price, it's going to bring more of these innovations to market at scale, because the individuals who are starting these businesses have an incentive to bring them to market. And so, the access to viable commercial markets and regulatory incentives are a really important piece of really being able to scale up this category effectively. And so, we have talked to a number of individuals who are thinking about whether or not they will actually be kind of some national cap and trade, much as what we've seen in California. And so there's some discussions around that. And all of that certainly it'll have immediate ramifications for some of these businesses and how effectively they scale. I think in particular on the carbon technology side. On the nature-based side, I think the role that pricing plays is if there's carbon pricing uncertainty, investors are interested in securing the units of carbon by owning the asset, because they don't have to worry about the price. So if you need, 100,000 tons of carbon, you can buy a property that is going to plant trees and grow those trees over a period of time to get you to those units. And so if the price of carbon doubles in the next, 5 to 10 years, you have somewhat of a hedge against that pricing. And so that's how we kind of think about how it could flow through those different types of investments.
I have a question. Lisa, can you, with regard to carbon technology category, can you provide any specific examples of firms or industries that you're working with to get a better tangible idea of what kind of companies that you're considering or looking at in that category?
Sure. Yeah. So for carbon, and thank you for asking that question. So carbon technologies, we really kind of break it up into 3 different sub-themes. So one area is carbon infrastructure. So that's really looking at the companies that are kind of developing the underlying technology to capture carbon, whether they're doing that from ambient air or they're actually looking at large scale industrial plants and kind of creating solutions that plug onto the end of that process to capture emissions on site. So that's kind of the carbon infrastructure category. The second is carbon to value. So those are ones that are actually utilizing carbon to create products. So, a popular example has been cement. We've also looked at cross-laminated timber and e-fuels and certain green plastics, where they're actually taking this waste byproduct that those infrastructure companies are focused on and creating something of value. So carbon cure in that carbon to value area, which I think for us is an area that is of most interest, because we see kind of viable revenue models for carbon capture, is really looking at they've developed kind of an easy to adopt technology that really enables concrete producers to use carbon to produce low carbon concrete mixes. And the process is very interesting because it is sequestering carbon, but it's also enhancing the strength and durability of the concrete. So it's a higher quality product as well. And so we think that's a really good example of a one-to-one win as it relates to environmental sustainability and, really strong business model. And so Carbon Cure has actually been very public about the work that they're doing to be a net zero company and kind of how they think about the mechanics of their partnership with corporates, as well as building companies that are using their products. So that's kind of the carbon to value category. And then the last category, which, a number of the oil majors have actually been very involved in this. I think for us, we found it harder to find investment opportunities in that category, but it's this concept of permanent carbon storage. And so that's really companies that allow for carbon to be permanently sequestered in the biosphere. So if you think about an oil company that's used its wells, you now have these empty spaces that could potentially be used to store carbon underground somewhat permanently. And so I think that there has been a lot of research around these technologies to do permanent carbon storage. I think there are some questions around permanence and how do we avoid potential leakages for those types of investment opportunities. I think from our perspective also, as we look at investments, I think there's strategic value for an oil company that can now utilize these wells, but as an entry point for us as investors, it's been a little bit more challenging. So we've tended to focus more on companies that are in that kind of carbon infrastructure category, where they're figuring out different ways to actually pull the carbon and then the carbon to value, where they can then convert that captured carbon into a useful product like fuel or plastic or building materials.
Lisa, there's a couple questions in the chat from Marguerite. I guess I can read them. Should we worry that bad offset approaches are so much cheaper than real approaches that the ineffective approaches drive out or make impractical the best ideas? For example, savings in carbon by comparing your spruce forest segment to a mixed forest to generate credits.
Yeah, so I think this is a really important consideration. And I think at the surface, and we're not very public about everything that we're doing, but I think at the surface, you're going to see a lot of strategies that say that they're doing things in decarbonization. They say that they're doing things in forestry. And at a high level, yes, we're all buying these assets and we're planting trees and trying to sustainably, and in our instance, we're trying to sustainably manage them. But I think that biodiversity is an important consideration that, you know, not everyone is thinking about. It's very easy to have a short-term focus when you're implementing these strategies. And for us, and this is part of the reason why, you know, Goldman Sachs, we're experts at diligencing investment managers. We're not experts at silviculture and forestry management. And so we try to find the best groups that could keep us honest from an investment standpoint, but also a long-term climate impact standpoint. So we don't, you know, these projects are not going to work indefinitely if we're not thinking about biodiversity and local community impacts. And I think that this is what I believe differentiates our approach versus some of the other groups that might say, I'm going to buy a forest, I'm going to get as many units of carbon as I can, I'm going to sell off all those units to the market, I'm going to make a ton of money. Our objective is not to sell the carbon units. We actually want to find partners that want to invest in the assets and then get the units of carbon and retire them. So I think that sometimes there can be a trade-off that we should be honest about for some of these opportunities as it relates to return when there are so many social and environmental variables at stake and very long hold periods. You know, forestry investing is a decades-long process, and if the diligence isn't done properly from a communities and biodiversity standpoint, in those first several years, it has long-term ramifications. And so we tend to have a longer-term perspective on how we're looking at these opportunities. And in our diligence processes, like, these are the questions that we're asking our managers on the ground, because we don't want this to purely be a commercial endeavor, because we can make a lot of money potentially, but if we don't deliver on the carbon and if there is negative community impacts, then it becomes an issue for our clients, and it also, I think, runs at the detriment of the category at large.
Like I said, it makes me think just of a conversation we had yesterday or 2 days ago with the team that I referenced earlier, with Generations Investment Management, who is now prioritizing impact and decarbonization as opposed to financial return. But anyway, there's one more good question here. I want to make on the rubric of one question apiece, since this is so engaging. From John is a question we talked a lot about today, a lot today about carbon footprints and offsets. Very important. What do we know about nuclear waste and nuclear sources of energy? Where's the market moving on this, and what do sound ESG practices suggest about those? Any comment there?
I think it's a great question. It's not an area that we spend a lot of time on, I have to be honest with you. So I'd love to kind of see how the broader team is thinking about that. Very often, you know, we take these top-down looks at a given category, but we also look to our clients to bring these types of questions to us, and then we'll do the work and provide a view. But I would say that, you know, it's not a category that we spend a lot of time on, quite frankly, but I think it's an interesting one, and I'm happy to, you know, send a note to Dave after I get back to the team.
Any other questions in the chat? Lisa, I think you have another slide or two. A few more slides, is that right?
Dave, just one question. You know, this question that John brought up, my understanding is that the nuclear power, the way our technology exists and the way we set this all up, is that you have to have a huge plant with a lot of dangerous material in order to generate the kind of power and performance that make it worthwhile. And so I think most utilities are afraid to undertake the beginning and the carry out of a large nuclear plant, even though long term it may be more economically efficient. The regulations and the problems perhaps with the waste are ones that haven't been properly solved. So I think, you have to look toward something like France, where they have smaller plants, and I think France is able to generate a fairly substantial portion of their electricity with plants that are all almost exactly alike. But our system's not set up to do that. So I can understand for Lisa, saying that it's not something we spend a lot of time on, because I don't think there's an easy solution right now.
Right, well, we could digress, but I won't. I'll sit on my hands.
Okay.
Big group here, and keep things at an appropriate level. So I won't interject. So Lisa, what else from you?
I think that was it. I just wanted to talk about how we're thinking about the world and the work that we do. So I think if there aren't any other questions, I think that's it from me.
I didn't mean to close this off at all. We do have a little more time for questions for Lisa. I don't know, Lon, if you want to take a step back at all and talk about the process by which we're looking at private equity and private equity impact climate. Minothi alluded to it before, that we've seen probably 50 or so strategies in the last year or so. But for everyone here, just to contextualize things, there are really two places for investments like this in private equity climate impact. And they are as follows. In the participating annuity for the pension boards, there is an element of 10 to 15% in private assets, and we've been filling up that bucket. So participating annuity includes a number of investments like this, and ideas like this would be a source for investments there. And then secondarily, I think this pertains to Charles, John, and their organizations and the investment committees. The other place where investments like this can be made is in the Alternatives Balance Fund, or the endowment of the United Church of Christ. Of course, other investors can participate in that, but the national setting of the UCC is the primary investor in those alternatives. So there are a couple in there, but that would be the other place where the long-term nature of the endowment can handle somewhat illiquidity in exchange for impact and a little bit longer investment period. So just to kind of give you a little bit of sense. In terms of objectives that the pension boards, we've established roughly $40 million a year of incremental investments to continue to keep up with the growth of the participating annuity. But we've yet to really set targets at the national setting. We have a range, but still codifying, and hopefully the next investment committee will be a little bit more precise about the overall objectives. And then stepping back even further is the overall objectives of working on climate change initiatives and investments, and the overall idea that we're trying to establish some targets so we can fit all of our investments within the context of what we're trying to achieve over the next couple of years. So hopefully that's a bit helpful and not too confusing.
Dave, I think there is a question from Connie, or maybe not a question, to make distinction between impact investing and ESG investing.
Right. Do you want to take a shot at that?
I can take a shot, and then I will let Lisa or Carolyn to chime in.
Yeah.
So at both pension board and UCF, and then I think through the Alternative Balance Fund to the degree of UCCB, we look at ESG for the public markets. So for public equities and bond, and then their ESG in terms of negative screening, and then also positive kind of inclusion that we talked about at the beginning of our scan. And then on the private side, we look for impact investing, because each investment that made is deployable capital, and then can be measured with various impact metrics. And maybe I think, Lisa, that you can share some insights on what you're looking for the impact investing in privates in terms of the measurements and disclosures.
Yeah, so we do look at ESG on the private side as well. I think the distinction that we tend to make is ESG is really focused on the how, and impact investing is focused on the what. So you can have a company that has a low ESG score because they lack diversity, have poor governance, but actually is making a phenomenally wonderful product that can impact the environment in tremendous ways. And so whenever we're diligencing a strategy, we do focus on both the ESG piece as well as the underlying impact. I would say on the private side, we tend to lead with impact, and then we take a look at some of these ESG considerations. And so we actually have a colleague on our team. We send out an ESG due diligence questionnaire to our clients, and we review their portfolios for things like diversity and governance. And we pay very close attention to that at the initial part of our due diligence, but we also do an annual ESG review. So on the impact side, the metrics that we would be characterizing are more a function of a given theme. So it might be, quantum of emissions abated versus number of children served, or financial savings per individual customer. On the impact side, it can really depend on the category that an investment falls in. But for ESG, we're doing kind of a portfolio level assessment of policies and practices and procedures around how they're actually allocating to those companies.
And then we see more and more managers using SDGs in measuring the impact.
Alongside the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, and that's certainly true. Anyway, you are all still with us. Again, great to see your faces. I'm not going to have the last word. I'm going to turn it over very shortly to Brian, Charles, and John Dorauer. But from the investment team and the responsible investing team, Lon, Minotti, myself, and Matthew and Rick, and others who participated in all of this. Thanks to Sam and Viviana, Samantha and Viviana, who helped bring some logistics and keep me out of trouble. I want to thank everyone. I hope you agree that taking a look back to 2013 and a really sort of formative, in a formative way, helped determine where we are today was helpful. Hope you've seen that we've made some good progress, but have a lot more to do. And I hope you see the value in potentially setting some objectives for the investment and social responsible investing team as we look forward to the next 3 or 5 years. We have many more tools and approaches than we've ever had. And I'm just thinking back to when I first met Jim Entall. He looked at me and he said, "Dave, you make everything," right, John? I've told you the story. He looked at me and he said, "Dave, you make everything so complicated." And I turned to him and I said, "It is complicated because we don't have the investment managers and the investments like the ones that Lisa just outlined to be able to populate the portfolios. And now we do. And in fact, it's almost a little bit more challenging now because there are so many more, and we really have to be discerning so we don't lose any pensioners' monies or our church's monies. But anyway, I just want to thank everybody again, and thank you so much. At this point, I wanted let's turn it over to Brian first, then Charles, and then John. John, you lead us out.
Well, thank you, Dave. First of all, I want to extend my thanks to all of our participants today. I hope that you have found the presentations to be engaging and instructive, and I hope that it results in more thinking and inquiries on your part, and that you will take the opportunity to reach out to us and suggest to us what we might do to improve what we're doing, how you would like to be engaged with us, and what you would like to see as we move forward. I want to also especially thank the investment team, Dave, Lon, Minotti, all of your support staff, Samantha, everyone, and I'm sure I'm missing a number of people. You have done a wonderful job in assembling this comprehensive event, and I truly thank you for that. It's important for all of us to support the continuing efforts of our investment staff to proactively continue to address all of the climate risks within our portfolios and to continue to be active in our engagement. I want to personally pledge my support for all of their activities and for all of the initiatives that have been set into motion thus far. But my pledge of support is not enough. We need to have all of you, particularly those who participate in governance roles for our organizations, to make similar commitments and pledges of support. So when I think about what it means when the pension boards says it operates at the intersection of faith and finance, today some statements were made about how do we understand intersectionality? What does that mean? And it caused me to think a lot about that. And one thing I wanted to mention is that the pension boards has made a strong commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And in doing so, we have made a number of commitments. And as a part of those commitments, we have committed to socially responsible investing. And Dave and the investment team has helped us to formulate what those commitments are and what the specific action are and into the near term. Part of what they've helped us formulate is that we are going to be an advocate and supporter for the continuing efforts that have taken place and have been led by our investment team. We are also going to be engaging intelligently and constructively with all of the entities that may have some impact or some effect on our success. I want to offer up to all of you as trustees, as directors, as stakeholders, your counsel in formulating and setting policies and direction for us is going to be extremely important. Help provide us with the best-in-class governance for all of our organizations as we move forward. So once again, I want to thank all of you for your participation, and we hope to hear more from each of you. Charles?
Well, thanks, Brian. And I want to join you first in thanking Dave, Lon, Minotti, Matthew, Rick, Samantha, Viviana, and again, probably all those, I'm neglecting to mention just because I can't see them on the screen. I mean, you conceived, you brainstormed, you planned, you hosted today, and it's just been phenomenal. And I hope we do more things like this in the future. And really, I want to thank all of you who've given your time on a summer Thursday, whether morning or afternoon, to be here. We are investment committees, social and responsible investing committees, trustees, board members. There was a time, I think, not long ago when investment committees tended to focus solely on the returns and performance. And it's clear just from looking at what we're doing today that we care about so much more. It's the double bottom line. We understand how ESG is important, even to the returns and the performance. So I think we are in a completely different place, as Jim kind of teed up at the beginning. And what we've discovered is that, as David said, it is a much more complicated world, but we're not afraid, and we are dealing with it. Probably like some of you, I subscribe to the Sojourners verse and voice of the day, and today's was very interesting. They were quoting Wendell Berry, who, among other things, is an environmental activist. And he wrote this back in 1973. He said, "Be like the fox who makes more tracks than necessary, some in the wrong direction. Practice resurrection." And I like that because, you know, it just really fits well with our task. The climate action journey, it's been a long one. We've come a long way, we heard that, but it's not been without some resistance, maybe some hesitation, even missteps and course corrections along the way. And today we realize that we've got still that long road ahead. We'll probably find some more resistance, hopefully less hesitation. And we have to expect further missteps, I think, in course corrections that come with it. But it's really important that we don't let that stop us or that we fail to act. As long as our intentions are good, our purposes are clear, our spirit's willing, we will find that there is resurrection, resurrection of life, resurrection of the earth, resurrection of the human soul. So let us, this is my charge for you, to be, for all of us, let us be like the fox, making lots of tracks in all sorts of different directions, and ultimately we will get where we need to be, even as God has willed it. So I'm going to turn to John now and invite you to give us some closing words and the benediction.
Thank you, Charles, and thank you, Brian. And thank you, all the members of both of your staffs who put this together. This has been an incredibly rich and I think significant afternoon. I want to quickly do three things. First, I'm not an economist. There are two courses I took over my educational career that I took nothing away from: chemistry and economics. So there are times when I feel a little lost in these conversations. But I am a theologian, and I want to say make a brief theological observation that I think has direct applications to economic outcomes. Then I want to just say a brief word about why I think this afternoon is so important, and then I'll close with a word of prayer. There are two Psalms back to back, Psalm 23 and Psalm 24, whose first line, taken alone, make a very deep, profound theological statement. If we read, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," followed quickly by "the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof," it sets forth a fundamental notion for people of faith that God, as a shepherd, has supplied all that we need. And that all that the earth is made of is not something that we can claim the rightful, that the right of ownership over. It belongs to God, and we are but stewards of those resources and assets. And as a human community, we've reached a point in our evolutionary development where we step back and have to realize that our control of those resources has led us to the brink of extinction as a human race here on Earth. And that it is time for us as stewards to go back to the roots of what it was we confessed when we said, "The Lord is our shepherd, we shall not want, and the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof." That's just a theological observation I want to make. I want to follow that by saying why I think this afternoon was so important. I remember 2013. I remember the 2 years of debate with the pension boards, with United Church Funds, with other important covenant partners of the United Church of Christ that not only led to that moment, but led to the tension of that moment as the body deliberated the movement of the Holy Spirit and the will of the church moving forward. And it was tense. And I want to also articulate what I experienced in the conversations that followed the passage of that resolution, which was sitting around board tables, both with the pension boards and United Church Funds, and listening to what I observed was the inability of two audiences to communicate clearly to one another what it was that was driving them. You had and this is going to be a gross generalization, but you had the idealists on the one hand who led with, "We need to save the earth," and the pragmatists on the other hand, who had a fiduciary responsibility, understood the need, not just a legal responsibility, but the burden of protecting the assets that fund the mission of this denomination. And it was hard for the two of them either to hear each other or find common ground to walk upon. We've come a long way in 8 years since 2013. And what I saw today was common ground, where this wasn't about the idealists versus the pragmatists. In fact, the pragmatists, and again, this is a gross overgeneralization, have not only on this call this afternoon, but in the years since, not only understood the value of saving the earth, and not only understood that as good fiduciaries, there's sound investment policy and practice in adopting these standards, but that in fact, we can approach these conversations with a level of economic sophistication that makes sense. We have come a long way. We are no longer fighting one another on this, but we are taking the expertise in the room and applying it to a denomination committed to saving the planet, and knowing that we can do that without sacrificing fiduciary responsibility. I can't tell you how proud I am. That is the United Church of Christ. This is who we are and who we have chosen to become with one another. And it only happened because we stayed at the table with each other through some of those very hard conversations. And I value that highly.